The court has always decided controversial cases. The decisions have always been subject to intense criticism, and that is entirely appropriate. Obviously, people can say what they want, and they're certainly free to criticize the Supreme Court, and if they want to say that its legitimacy is in question, they're free to do so, but I don't understand the connection between opinions that people disagree with and the legitimacy of the court.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. We so rarely hear from him. That was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Roberts, making today's rebuke by him of Donald Trump's rhetoric pretty darn remarkable. Chief Justice John Roberts scolding Donald Trump's call to impeach a federal judge. The Chief Justice saying this, quote, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for a purpose." About that, the New York Times writes this, quote, "Just weeks ago, Chief Justice Roberts' point would have been uncontroversial. There is no modern tradition of impeaching judges for their rulings. Just 8 federal judges have been impeached, convicted, and removed in the history of the country, most for egregious criminal and personal behavior. As noteworthy as Roberts' statement is, we are finally seeing him draw a red line when it comes to Donald Trump's attacks on the judiciary. It is worth pointing out, though, that this is not the first time Donald Trump has attacked a judge. We can go all the way back to before Trump took office the first time, when he attacked Judge Curiel, who was presiding over the Trump University lawsuit. Trump attacked him simply because of his background.
He is giving us very unfair rulings, rulings that people can't even believe. This case should have ended years ago on summary judgment. The best lawyers, I have spoken to so many lawyers, they said, this is not a case. This is a case that should have ended. This judge is giving us unfair rulings. Now I say why. Well, I'm building a wall, okay? And it's a wall between Mexico, not another country.
But he's not from Mexico.
In my opinion,
he's from Indiana.
He's Mexican heritage, and he's very proud of it.
And there have been, of course, numerous attacks by Donald Trump against other judges who have ruled against him since then, bringing us to his latest target, Judge James Boasberg. Trump calling for Judge Boasberg's impeachment following that judge's ruling that stops Trump's efforts to deport Venezuelan migrants by using the very rarely invoked Alien Enemies Act. The judge asked for DOJ to answer questions based on the timing of the flights over the weekend that saw over 200 alleged gang members deported to El Salvador, to which they replied to some. Judge Boasberg then followed that up this afternoon by asking for answers to more specific questions, giving them a deadline of noon tomorrow. It's where we start the hour. Some of our favorite experts and friends. Deputy Director of the Immigrants' Rights Project at the ACLU. Lee Gelernt is so busy, but he made time to join us, and we thank you. Lee's been facing off against the Trump administration in court over the Trump administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act. Also joining us, former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman's back, and MSNBC political analyst, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller's here. Lee, let me start with you and the case. Tell us the latest.
Yeah, so the latest is we're fighting on multiple fronts. As you know, Judge Boasberg issued a short temporary restraining order so he could hear more arguments, pointing out that the Alien Enemies Act is a special wartime authority that's only been used 3 times in our country's history, all during declared wars, the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II, and it basically says you can declare an immigrant, an alien enemy when there is a declared war with the United States or another foreign government or nation is invading us. And so given those limitations that Congress put in the law, it's not surprising it's only been used 3 times in our country's history. The president now has said, I'm going to use it against a gang and remove these people, not only remove them, but send them to a Salvadoran prison where, frankly, they're doomed. And not only am I going to use it against a gang, not a foreign government, but I'm not going to give people any chance to dispute whether they're a gang member. So that's all playing out. The judge issued this temporary restraining order. The government immediately appealed it and is in the Court of Appeals now seeking an emergency stay of that ruling. We just filed our brief 1 minute ago. We don't know when the Court of Appeals is going to rule or have oral argument on it. the same time, the district court's going to keep his expedited schedule. While all that's going on, the judge is also, the district court judge, Judge Boasberg, is also considering whether the government violated his order. He was very explicit. I mean, he could not have been more explicit in this Saturday night hearing we had with him, an emergency hearing. We said, I want these planes turned around if they're headed with these people and bring them back to the United States so we can sort this out. The government did not turn the planes around. There seems to be no dispute that the flights were still in the air at the time. The government is saying, well, they were out of U.S. airspace. The judge, is very skeptical of that argument, as are we. But as you pointed out in the introduction, is asking for more factual information. So we'll see how all that plays out and what findings the judge makes about whether his order was violated. But at the same time, we'll be arguing about the legality of the Alien Enemies Act's use here.
Lee, we had so many conversations between the re-election of Donald Trump and the inauguration and the commencement of the immigration policies about this moment. But I want to ask you something pointed about it. I mean, Trump's folks are all over right-wing media talking about a part of this story, right, about the president's right to deport violent criminals. That's something that has 87% public support. But why not? It seems that he has the authority, if these really are all Venezuelan gang members, to go ahead and deport them. Why cut out the part of the process where you simply have to prove that or provide any evidence that that's the case?
Exactly, Nicole. That you're hitting it right on the head. That's the situation. They are playing this out as if the judge has ordered them to release people or precluded the government from arresting people or precluded the government from deporting them. The immigration laws give the government enormous authority if someone genuinely is deportable, is a gang member who has committed crimes. What the immigration laws do, what Congress has said is, though, give them process so they can contest that, right? And so the government's making vague allegations about who's a gang member, who's not, and cutting out all process. The reason they're using the Alien Enemies Act is precisely to cut out any process and to be able to send them to a Salvadoran prison. Under the immigration laws, they couldn't be sent to a Salvadoran prison to be held there indefinitely. So that's exactly why they're using it. But anybody who thinks that the question is, should these people be allowed to roam around the United States, or should they be sent to a Salvadoran prison? That's the wrong framing. They can be removed to Venezuela after they go through the process if they lose.
And Tim Miller, this seems to be the political nexus that the Trump White House hopes no one crosses, right? They would love for everybody in the media to be pressing on the substance of who has been deported. But I think it's the process here that is the bigger story, right? You take a group for whom, if the facts are there, literally 0% of Americans are sympathetic to their legal rights. But they have rights. They're human beings. And if we don't actually know if people as young as 14 are actually members of a gang, it feels like the process is what should focus our mind.
Yeah, and it should scare people, to give the government this kind of power when they've shown that they're going to act so recklessly across so many verticals. Look, I hear you on how the specific cases are, sometimes, get you bogged down into an area that gets onto Trump's turf. But why don't I try you on one of the cases here for one of these, the Venezuelans that allegedly has been sent to El Salvador. According to a lawyer that we interviewed for the Bulwark, that this person is a gay Venezuelan that has tattoos because they're in the arts. They're into arts. They were in America in a detention center, so they're not roaming the streets. This was not a dangerous person. So somebody that was fleeing a communist country. So again, thinking of what Republicans had traditionally been for. This is somebody that fled communism to come find freedom in America. And according to this person's lawyer, I will have to see the details, they have been disappeared by our government, put on a plane, sent to El Salvador to like a dystopic RoboCop penal camp. And like you've seen the images from this is like nothing that we would do in this country. So I don't know, Nicole, maybe that's popular with people. Like maybe the American people are for Donald Trump and Elon Musk willy-nilly choosing to send people who are fleeing communism to disgusting prison camps in other countries with no due process. I'm not for that. I find that absolutely despicable, and I think that it's worthwhile to at least make the case. And we need to know more. We need to know more about some of these cases. And I think that you're right at the biggest picture, talking about the process here, talking about the fact that these people did not get a chance to defend themselves in a court of law. And again, I think it's okay to say that if in some of these cases they're really gang members, they're out in the street doing crimes, then great, like send them out. Everybody's for that. But this process where like Stephen Miller and Tom Homan and Elon and Donald Trump just get to decide that somebody gets sent to El Salvador because they had a tattoo, I mean, that is not America.
Say more, Tim Miller.
Well, it just is. Look, it's fundamentally what the country has been about. I don't know. I remember when I was younger, one of the things that made me a Republican, actually, that kind of radicalized me was the Elian Gonzalez situation, right? When the Clinton folks were in charge. And obviously all these things have complicated specifics. But like America is a country that welcomed people that were fleeing persecution, fleeing religious persecution, fleeing government persecution. That's like why we exist. That is the whole point of America. And particularly in this case, when it comes to people fleeing a communist country to come here to find freedom. And if they came here to do crimes, then send them back. But if they came here to find freedom, and we are going to treat them in the same way that a authoritarian country would. We're going to send them to some other country where they're going to shave off their hair and put them in shackles and put them in chains and not feed them and treat them like they're subhuman with no due process. Like, what is the difference between us and China then, or Russia? Like, honestly, like what is the difference between us and authoritarian countries if this is how we're going to treat people that are coming here looking for a chance to live a life? Like, again, we can argue about the policy. If you want to say, sorry, we can't take any more refugees from Venezuela, we've taken too many, you have to go home. Okay. But we're just going to pick you up off the street because you have a tattoo and send you to an El Salvador RoboCop dystopia? No.
Well, we are getting a readout, Keir Simmons, and I know you don't have it. And I haven't been able to read the entire thing because it was just handed to me. But this is from the. You've got it now?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So it's from the news agency.
We have the Russian readout, Chris, if that's... Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And you can tell me, but the part that I got to that raised a red flag was this. It was emphasized that the key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working toward its resolution by political and diplomatic means should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv. But maybe you've had a chance to read the entire thing, which I'm only about halfway through.
Yeah, I'm still picking through it myself, Chris. It's been translated from Russian. One thing I will tell you, just for viewers to know, and the viewers will understand that we're still making sense of this, is that the Kremlin readout and the White House readout is different. So they haven't kind of agreed a joint statement. They've put out their different interpretations of what's been said. I will say that as far as we can tell from the Kremlin readout, it does not include a mention of the Black Sea. So one of the points I would make here is that I think that this is still negotiations in progress. So a week ago, the Ukrainians appeared to agree to, well, they agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, punctuation point, nothing more. Here you have a negotiation between the US and the Russians about all kinds of things, not simply a ceasefire. Now, what the Kremlin does say, and I'll just read this piece because, as Garrett suggested, this is important. During the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from striking energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded positively to this initiative and immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. So it appears right now the Russians have agreed to and are implementing a 30-day ceasefire in respect of energy infrastructure facilities. simply that. Now, there is a lot more to this Russian readout, including a lot about prisoner exchanges and the Russians handing over Ukrainian prisoners, for example. And it is kind of described, or it is portrayed in this Russian readout as the Russians, offering compromise in a sense. But there isn't really much compromise in this beyond that. And as you mentioned, this question of whether the US is agreeing to restrict support for Ukraine during this ceasefire, that will be deeply controversial because, okay, after the ceasefire, what happens? What kind of negotiation is there during the ceasefire over what kind of support Ukraine might get? And, of course, one of President Putin's long-standing aims has been to ensure that Ukraine is neutral, and Ukrainians would say to neutralize the country. So that would appear to be a concession to the Russians. There's another point in here which I didn't hear. I haven't seen the Washington readout, but I didn't hear, Chris, in what you were sharing with viewers. The Russian readout talks a lot about normalization, which translates as removing sanctions, rebuilding economic ties, the kind of things that the Russians really want. One last point, Chris, in this Russian readout, which kind of gets your attention, although it may seem fairly small compared with the others. It says Donald Trump supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organize hockey matches in the US and Russia between Russian and American players playing in the NHL and the KHL.
All right, so let me go back to you, if I can, Garrett. The look on your face may say everything about hockey, but on the bigger picture, clearly these are two very different statements and no decisions. That there's no clarity on any agreement here.
Well, look, I think there are a couple of points. On the idea of the 30-day ceasefire against energy infrastructure, that does seem to be the big key deliverable point that is, at least in principle, agreed on in both statements. The Kremlin statement goes farther than does the White House statement. The Kremlin statement does also mention President Putin, it says, responding favorably to President Trump talking about this peace or security initiative related to the Black Sea. So there's at least an acknowledgement that that was a topic that came up. I was smiling at Keir's mention of the point about hockey because I was just reading to that myself, and I actually don't think it's a small thing at all because to me it tells me that the Russians have a pretty good read on the way that Donald Trump likes to engage in diplomacy. He cares about the personal relationships with the people that he conducts diplomacy with, other foreign leaders, perhaps more than other American presidents do. He likes to have those touch points with those people. He likes to have those relationships, and he likes to talk about sports. And the idea that President Putin would bring up hockey, which we know that the president has recently been interested in when there was that Four Nations Cup going on here in the U.S. with the U.S., Canada, other nations, as a way to generate some kind of goodwill between two foreign leaders of countries that have had no goodwill between them for some number of years, I think is sort of a notable thing to do in the first place, and to include by the Russians that they are sort of operating in this way, trying to talk about something in this kind of friendly and personal manner with Donald Trump. It tells me they understand the way he likes to engage in diplomacy, and I don't think that's a small thing at all.
I don't think so, Mark. Garrett makes a really good point, and he's old enough, Donald Trump, to have lived through the Cold War, to remember the Miracle on Ice, to remember when Jimmy Carter decided to pull from the U.S., to change the Olympics, to pull the U.S. from the Olympics. I mean, he also knows what entertainment is, right? And whether or not you consider, whatever you consider the relationship to be between the United States and Russia at this point, a hockey game is something that would attract a lot of attention and that Donald Trump would enjoy. But big picture, how do you see this?
Well, let me say the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey win over the Soviet Union was probably one of the great moments of my life. I played high school hockey, so this was a fantastic experience for me. And don't forget, and I can't believe we're talking about this, but Alex Ovechkin, who is a Russian who plays for the Washington Capitals, who was a friend of Putin, is 8 goals away from breaking the all-time NHL record. So perhaps the Russians did have something in raising this. But on a serious note,
and you
big
just
picture,
knew that off the top of your head, so I'm impressed with your hockey knowledge. Yeah, okay.
But big picture, look, there are clearly different readouts of this. I think the Russians are doing what they do, which is throw in kind of details and roadblocks. There's going to be negotiation after negotiation. A lot of people are going to pick through certain things that presumably would be favorable, but then a lot which would be unfavorable. But overall, I think that everyone who has spoken now is correct in the sense of these are negotiations that are going on right now. I would not get too optimistic. The Russians are very tough negotiators. I think there's a long way to go. On one note to mention is, Europe was really holding their breath at this phone call, and perhaps it's not as bad as many would have thought, which would have been, in their view, that the U.S. would kind of sell Ukraine down the river. So I would say this is just another step in the negotiations. The Russians are going to play hardball, and maybe we'll get a good hockey game out of it.
Well, where does this leave Ukraine, though, Mark?
So from the Ukrainian side, I think what they see is, of course, two major powers, the U.S. and Russia, talking about the future of their country. And that's deeply disturbing to the Ukrainians, but also to the rest of Europe. I would hope there will be some readouts given to Ukraine from the U.S. side. And the real key point on this in terms of concessions or the future is the provision of both intelligence and military assistance. That cannot be something that the Russians might agree to it. The U.S. in no way can agree to that, and Ukrainians certainly would not as well. You don't do that before any kind of ceasefire negotiations. That's a non-starter.
Can I go back for just a second, Garrett, to the end of the first page of this translation, which is March 19th, which happens to be tomorrow. A prisoner exchange would be carried out. You mentioned this between the Russian and Ukrainian sides, 175 for 175 people. And as a gesture of goodwill, 23 seriously wounded Ukrainian servicemen who are undergoing treatment in a Russian medical institutions will be transferred. Donald Trump is also someone who likes to say, I got a deliverable. I told you that I was going to work on this, and here's what I have for you.
Yeah, that's true, Chris. And frankly, it's kind of White House diplomacy 101 that you would not involve the president of the United States in negotiations unless there is a deliverable to be had. This White House does so many things in non-traditional ways, but this is something that you would actually expect to see almost in any other White House, where the negotiations happen at a lower level first, and then when there's a victory to be claimed, you bring in the president to claim it. Notably, the White House statement does not mention that prisoner exchange, although I was reminded that this was something that came up when President Zelensky was in the Oval Office for that incredibly ill-fated meeting he had here just a few weeks ago. Zelensky talked about the fact that when he was being pressed by J.D. Vance about past diplomatic efforts, that Russia had failed to honor past agreements to do prisoner swaps just like this. So I think it's both an important deliverable and another important touch point in kind of building trust here and goodwill between at least the U.S. and Russia, and perhaps the Ukrainians and Russia as well, that started with the release of Mark Fogel a couple of years ago around the first Trump-Putin phone call, and now could potentially include this prisoner swap if and when that does occur, as is suggested to be happening tomorrow in the Russian readout, but again, not in the White House readout.
Joe, you have the Attorney General of the United States saying that a judge's order is an intrusion on the president's authority. You have Tom Homan, the border czar, saying those flights are going to continue today and saying, Joe, quote, I don't care what the judges think. So where do we go from here?
It's like saying if you're in the government, I mean, it's like saying I don't care what the clouds think. They're not allowed to rain today. I mean, yeah, you have to care what the judges think, because that's Madisonian, it's Madison constitutional law. He has to do it. And this happens, like we said, Stephen Miller saying this is the greatest judicial abuse or whatever he said of all time. It's not even close. And here's the thing. Chances are very good that the Supreme Court will provide the President of the United States wide latitude on issues of immigration. They just can't violate a judge's order because they don't want to wait for the appeals. And this happens to every president. The idea that people are acting shocked and stunned and deeply sad, like, oh, it's like, it's like they've never read newspapers. I was going to say never read law books, but it's like they've never read newspapers. They've never watched news. This happens to every president. Let me just give you a couple of examples of district court judges in conservative districts who stopped rulings of Democratic presidents. During the Obama administration in 2015, a U.S. District Court judge from Texas, appointed by George W. Bush, issued an injunction halting President Obama's DAPA program, which wanted to shield millions of undocumented immigrants from deportation. Stopped it. And then it got appealed, and then the Supreme Court ruled 4-4. Ended up against Barack Obama in 2016. A U.S. District Court judge, also from Texas, also appointed by Bush, issued a nationwide injunction that blocked the Obama administration's guidance requiring schools to allow bathroom access based on gender identity. In 2021, a single U.S. District Court judge nominated by Donald Trump temporarily blocked President Biden's administration from enforcing a COVID-19 vaccine mandate for federal contractors. And it's not just federal judges who are conservative from the state of Texas who've ruled against Democratic and Republican presidents. In 2006, a U.S. District Court judge appointed by Jimmy Carter ruled that the Bush administration's program of eavesdropping without warrants was illegal and unconstitutional and violated the Fourth Amendment. Claire, I go back to what I was telling my Republican brothers and sisters during the impeachment of Bill Clinton. I said, just be careful. Don't think that there will never be another Republican president again. Hold this president to the same standard that you would want a Republican president held to. And these Republican senators and members of the House that are sitting back while they're saying we're going to defy the courts are acting as if there's never going to be a Democrat. What if there's a progressive president that's elected in 2028 because of the overreach of the MAGA right? And then that progressive judge says, well, or that progressive president says, well, the Trump administration ignored judges' rulings they don't like, so I'll just ignore judges' rulings that I don't like. That puts us in such a dark place. Bad if a conservative does it, bad if a MAGA conservative does it, bad if a progressive does it. The fact is, Claire, no president, certainly this century or last, has ever done this.
Yeah, and talking about the Republican Party, Joe, historically, the Republican Party has been the one railing against too much executive action. They have been the one railing against government that has a heavy hand. They're the one that has been railing against government who does not think they have to prove with facts any action taken against people in America. Okay? And this protects all Americans. It protects people who are here legally. It does not protect immigrants. And what really people need to understand is this judge never said that Donald Trump cannot make people leave this country that have committed crimes that are here illegally. He didn't do that. He went out of his way to say he was not doing that. He was merely saying it is time for there to be some evidence about what has happened here and how it happened. But rather than do that, we have the Attorney General of the United States of America saying that this federal district judge, who, by the way, is the Chief Justice, the chief judge among all of the judges in the D.C. area of all the federal judges, saying that he likes terrorists, accuses him of being friendly to terrorists, because all he said was, wait a minute, we need to have a hearing so the American people are protected by the law, and the big government is required to go through their paces and prove their case. That's all that happened here. So that's particularly egregious that the Republican Party, who is in a lay-down mode to the executive completely taking over the other two branches of government, that they're letting this go by without anybody saying anything about how dangerous it is. And you're right. Someday there'll be a Democratic president that will want to overstep their bounds, and then the Republicans will have to lie in what they've created.
And that's the through line, Claire, what you just said. Try to expand the power of the executive branch. Even just the last few days, what we saw the president's speech at DOJ talking about using law enforcement to go after his political enemies, threatening to muzzle the news media, his claim, nonsensical perhaps, to try to avoid President Biden's pardons. And then, Mike, certainly everything we're seeing here about this defiance of a court order, even if they're arguing, hey, we didn't quite defy this one, they're clearly laying the groundwork to potentially do so down the road. And they're putting Democrats in a political bind here. Democrats who are saying, look, we're a nation of laws. You have to have due process. You have to, respect a judge's ruling. But the gamble the Trump administration is making, I'm told by several people involved, is that they are putting up what they deem unsavory characters, these gang members, although we should be clear, there's some questions as to the identities of some of the people there. There's some immigration advocates think that some innocents have been rounded up with this group. And saying, go ahead, try to defend these people, which they put out in this highly produced, almost Hollywood-like video of them being put into one of the most hellish places on earth, this prison in El Salvador, and saying, look, yeah, try to defend that.
Well, thus you are outlining what is the pivotal point of the Trump administration, of Donald Trump's life, as a matter of fact, even including as president of the United States, the theater of things, the production values of things. When you see what we just saw, the perp walk of supposed criminals, immigrants here illegally, being perp walked out toward a plane, all dressed in, white and bent over and dragged by guards and everything like that. What you're seeing is a group of people that very few Americans are going to defend. They're going to say, yeah, fine, get them out of the country. They came here illegally. They pose a threat to us. The nub of it, though, is in doing that, they are violating probably some American laws that ought not to be violated, and they are doing it with seeming impunity. From Tom Homan saying, I don't care what the judge thinks, to that, it's a very thin line between what happens there and what's going to happen, perhaps, if they continue to do this, to an ordinary average American citizen taken off the streets here in this country.
And Claire, this gets at the foundation of what we do as a country and always have done, of our democracy, which is the courts decide, the courts issue orders, you can appeal those orders, you can go all the way up to the Supreme Court if you want to. So I guess the question is, what happens as a practical matter if the judge rules against the administration and they keep doing this? And they do what Tom Homan says, which is the flights are going to continue regardless of what a judge tells us.
Well, there are several things that are going to happen. All these cases are going to wind up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is going to have a moment in our legal history where they will more aggressively define the limits of executive power. There's a lot of people who watch the Supreme Court closely who think they're going to go further than probably most Americans would be comfortable with. But nevertheless, they're going to decide. And I think there's a number of things that Trump has done that put him in a bad place with the Supreme Court. And I would put near the top of this list not only define a court order, which is going to really rankle people who were district court judges and were appellate judges that are on the Supreme Court, but also this idea that they're going after law firms who have represented people that Donald Trump doesn't like. That's a pretty scary thing.
Private
law firms. To a large law firm who most of the people at that law firm have never seen Jack Smith, don't know Jack Smith, had nothing to do with Jack Smith, but trying to cut off their livelihood because their firm represented someone who was unpopular with the sitting president. That is really going to be something that judges are going to go, whoa, 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 whoa. Our entire system depends on people who are bad people getting lawyers, much less somebody who is just doing their job under the facts, which was Jack Smith. So it's really, I think, going to be a moment where the Supreme Court, they're not popular right now for a lot of ethical transgressions that have occurred in the recent past. But John Roberts has a big job here. Frankly, Amy Coney Barrett has a big job here. I think the other four are lost on the MAGA island, but those two, I think, have shown a willingness to really take a hard look at executive power and the overreach. Let me say it again. This is the overreach of big government. And all the folks out there in Missouri who have told me at hundreds of town halls, we want government off our backs, I don't think they realize that they have unleashed, what did she call the Kraken or whatever it was, in terms of big government overreach with what this administration is trying to do.
President Trump is admitting he has used AutoPen to sign certain documents. The president made those comments just hours after he announced on social media he would void the pardons issued by former President Biden to members of the January 6th committee because Trump claimed those pardons were signed with an AutoPen. So what is that? It's a mechanical device used to replicate a person's authentic signature. A lot of stuff for any president to sign. Sometimes they use the AutoPen. Here's President Trump yesterday, asked by NBC News about his own use of AutoPen.
Have you yourself ever used AutoPen, sir?
Yeah, only for very unimportant papers. And I don't call them unimportant. If you do letters where people write in and, you know, they'd love to have a response, or we'll write responses, and I'll sign them whenever I can. But when I can't, I, would use an AutoPen. But to use them for what they've used them for is terrible.
Yes, sir. And when you signed the CR,
Who are you with?
Sir, I'm with NBC News.
Oh, that's the same one. I don't want to talk to NBC anymore. I think you're so discredited.
Doesn't like a question, discredit the source. President Biden and Obama both use an AutoPen device to sign official documents, a practice that is legally binding. That's according to a 2005 guidance from the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, commissioned by President George W. Bush. So, John, for people who've never heard of an AutoPen, and they can be forgiven for not, it's not thing we talk about a whole lot. Why is this controversial at this moment?
It isn't, but those on the right tried to make it in recent days. And this is yet another example of something that emerged on the fringes of the right-wing social media that finds its way to the Oval Office. And Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, others on the fringe right started putting out this idea last week sometime that President Biden had used an AutoPen to sign these last-minute pardons that came in his last full day of office, and some came the morning of his last day in office, and therefore they would be invalid, that the pen wouldn't be have legal binding. But, Mike, we know, I mean, as Willie just read, the government has found, the Office of Legal Counsel has found that they're just fine. President Trump has used them. President Obama has used them. I remember that he also sometimes got in trouble for using the AutoPen, more for political optics reasons rather than suggesting something wasn't legally binding. But it's just another case of Republicans. It's A, hypocrisy, and B, trying to, for Donald Trump, take shots at his predecessor.
And again, in addition to that, what you just said, it's also part and parcel of the production values of this administration, Claire. Every day there is something that they flood the nation with, some obscure thing from AutoPens to whatever. Every day there's an element of production in there to keep people's minds off of what is actually being done every day behind the scenes that's not on the news.
Yeah, but his poll numbers are slipping because he's not paying attention to the things Americans care about. Everybody wants to talk about what the NBC poll showed about Democrats' approval rating. There hasn't been enough attention to what the poll showed about Putin's approval rating.
So let me ask you a question. As a longtime Democratic stalwart, Democratic senator, why aren't the Democrats outside Social Security offices, VA clinics, hospitals, schools, and supermarkets to document and talk about exactly what you were just talking about, the average life of the average American and what's being done with it?
I think they are beginning to do more of that. I think the key for them is to get outside of Washington. It's very hard for a senator to look in the mirror and go, nobody cares what I say on the Senate floor. But that's kind of the truth. Giving a speech on the Senate floor typically just goes into the ether and nobody ever notices. But if you are getting on the local news, talking to somebody who can't get their Social Security figured out because the branch office is closed down and there's nobody to talk to, or if you are someone whose child is going through a cancer trial with NIH and has a chance of becoming well again, but all of a sudden that's been yanked away. Those are the stories that need to be continually put on local news, and to whatever extent you can get them on national news, great. But this idea that you're going to win the argument from Washington is not a good idea. And Donald Trump is concentrating mostly on revenge and retribution. He said he wouldn't, and that's what he's doing when he's not talking about invading Canada.
And by the way, those stories are not partisan. Those are human stories
Those
from
are human
Republicans
stories.
and Democrats about the suffering they're enduring. By the way, even the New York Post disagrees with this move. Its latest editorial titled, "Mr. President dropped this petty push to void Biden's auto pen pardons." The Post writes, "Sorry, any such investigation isn't just beating a dead horse. It's digging the horse out of the ground and trying to saddle it. Voters want him looking forward to building that new golden age," talking about Donald Trump, "not back at old grievances. Sorry, Mr. President, relitigating any of it is a gift to the resistance, handing another stick to beat you with. Any undermining of pardons signed via robot would require fact-finding probes and court action when the new administration has bigger facts to find and larger issues to litigate." The Post continues, "Trump has enough real work to do, especially on the economy, and has the support of voters to do it. Going down this rabbit hole would be shooting himself in the foot." The New York Post talking about Donald Trump's latest effort on auto pen.
And also, let's just talk about his latest effort to distract. Suddenly, yesterday, just minutes after his auto pen screed, announced that today they're going to release all of the John F. Kennedy assassination files. We have no idea what's in there. Allegedly, 80,000 documents coming, but yet another effort quickly deduced as, let's just change the topic of conversation.
Changing the subject. Still ahead.